Sexual Follies. So Ross Douthat, who is the kind of conservative columnist on Knucklehead Row at the New York Times, and he's a Catholic, and that's what makes him, so there's conservatism there, is talking about the 70s after the Harvey Weinstein thing came out. And he was talking about how during the 70s, it was really the height of the sexual revolution. And he says you can look at it through the statistics. There were never so many divorces in the 70s, never so many abortions as in the 70s, a much higher rate of rape, an STD crisis that culminated in the AIDS epidemic. And he says, you can see that you can see in the exploitation, just in terms of narrative, in terms of the stories about the 70s, the drug-enabled exploitation of kids, a grimly horrifying scale. He says much of rock and roll's groupie culture was a spree of statutory rape, with the gods of rock and roll as serial deflowerers of girls who were really young. In the same era of Anything Goes Hollywood's Roman Polanski had good reason to regard sodomizing a 13-year-old as what they let you do when you're a star. And you remember Harvey Weinstein put out this statement when he was talking about why he was raping women and cornering them and, touching himself in front of them and asking them to give him massages and watch him shower. Well, I came of age in the 70s. That was his excuse, And Douthat says, things have gotten better. People, as we just heard from Dr. Twenge, people are, young people are having sex less, all this stuff. But he says, but let us not congratulate ourselves too quickly. There are ways in which we have passed from eros to thanatos, to death, from the chaos of unrestrained desire to the stability of senescence. Our era is less overtly sexually destructive, in part because we're giving up on sex itself, retreating into pornography and other virtual consolations. In the 1970s, people left their marriages because they believed some higher fulfillment awaited. In the 2010s, they marry less, have less sex once married, and have fewer children, opting out of promiscuity and procreation. Both abortion rates are down, but suicide rates are up. Really interesting. And I want to talk, I'm going to go a little long here. I'm reading a biography of the poet Shelley. It's a huge book. I've been reading it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I always like to read about the Romantic era because it was very much like our era. And, there was an era of revolution. It was the French Revolution came first. Then that revolution failed as our 60s revolution kind of failed. And in England especially, there was a reaction of conservatism as we had Ronald Reagan, we had the Reagan years. But as that held off the revolution, but the liberalism and the leftism came in slowly, over time. And when Shelley was a poet, the English were trying very hard to stamp out the revolutionary impulse by censoring people, by putting people in jail if they wrote anything that seemed revolutionary. And Shelley was a radical. I've always disliked him as a human being because of his radicalism and because of his sexual promiscuity, which caused so much death and destruction all around him. He was a genius poet. Some of these poets, if they only lived for like the 5 days in which they wrote their great poems, because they would jot them down. Oh, yes, I saw the west wind blowing, and I wrote down this poem, and it'll be Ode to the West Wind, one of the most beautiful poems in all of literature. Shelley believed in equality between the sexes and in free sex. And as a result of this, he constantly was getting people pregnant, not just Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. He left his wife for Mary Shelley, and she committed suicide because he abandoned her with their children. Mary Shelley's children would die. Shelley would impregnate her half-sister, and that child would die. He impregnated a maid, and she would die, and that child would die. He left a swath of destruction. I'm very opposed to abortion. I simply believe it's killing. I think there's just no getting around it. But I do understand that there is something in the impulse to make women and men equal, to make their lives equal, to make their sexual lives free. This has been in people's minds since Adam and Eve, to be free sexually, to be equal sexually, to be the same. And the thing that gets in the way are these darn babies. They get in the way because when you have sex with women, they do this weird thing where they start to reproduce, and that is, this unavoidable unavoidable consequence. Even with birth control, it still happens. And so the impulse toward abortion is not an evil impulse in itself. It is just so desperate to get to this freedom, to get to this sexual freedom, to get to this sexual equality, that it basically resorts to killing the most innocent, the weakest, the most helpless person, the one person in the room who can't protest, the one person in the room who has no vote, who can't go before Congress and tell his or her sad story, the mother who says, oh, if I had only had an abortion, my life would have been better, can go and tell her sad story on the news and make you cry, but the baby whose life has been snuffed out, he can't do that. He's been silenced. He's never had a voice. So all I want to say is this idea that creativity and rampant sexuality are connected may be true. There may be something to it. But the rampant sexuality has this moral problem. It has, like the speed of light, it has a place beyond which it cannot go. And unless we talk about that, instead of using these stupid terms like women's reproductive choice, women's sexual health, all these stupid terms they use to stop from using the term abortion, to keep from using the term killing, unless we can talk about to each other, to people who are pro-life and people who are pro-abortion, what it is we're talking about. We're talking about freedom and the price of freedom, and when that price becomes too much to pay. It would be a real change to hear that conversation, to hear a conversation about the basics. And until we do, we'll just remain stupid about sex, as we have been since the Garden of Eden. All right, the conversation is coming up at 2 o'clock here. I'll give you one more read through here. The conversation is on the Daily Wire Facebook page and the YouTube channel, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. I will answer all your questions live. We'll solve your problems live. But anyone can watch, but you have to be a subscriber to ask the questions. So get your lousy $10 in right now. And we'll see you tomorrow for the mailbag. Get those questions in as well. You do that by going onto the podcast page, and there's a button that takes you right to where you ask your questions. I'm Andrew Klavan. This is The Andrew Klavan Show, and we will see you at 2 p.m.